I'm Grace Berry. I'm the Genomics Project Manager at Cheshire and Merseyside Cancer Alliance. And I'm going to talk you through today our approach to the IMPACTT project and some of the findings and next steps around that as well. So IMPACTT stands for Improving Molecular Pathways and Cancer Turnaround Times. And the project has been working across the Northwest for the last year and a half or so, in partnership with the Northwest Genomic Medicine Service Alliance, the Genomic Lab Hub and the other regional cancer alliances as well. And we've worked to map and audit a number of the cancer pathways in order to support improvement work, to mitigate variants across the patch and ultimately look to reduce turnaround times within genomic pathways for patients. So each cancer alliance has chosen their own priority tumour groups based on the understood need or complexity of each of the pathways, and that was through discussion with stakeholders. In Cheshire and Merseyside, we've focused on gynae, and that's specifically for ovarian and endometrial cancers only, and then colorectal and breast cancers as well. We did collect some data on teenage young adult patients, but that will hopefully be used in some future work because it was a bit too big of a beast to take on at the minute, to be honest. And then we split our approach into 3 stages. So I'll go through each of these in turn. We've got pathway mapping, auditing work, and then just really collating a list of the issues and actions that we noticed throughout each of the encounters with system stakeholders as well. So the pathway mapping then, this is really just to show one example of the pathway mapping that was completed for ovarian and endometrial cancers. It's from point of biopsy right through to when or how the results are received in clinic. I've had to split it across 2 pages, so you have to bear with. But by doing this for every pathology site across Cheshire and Merseyside for each tumour group, we were able to really easily visualise the variance across pathways and processes, which hopefully you can see highlighted in red on these slides, and identify some improvements as we went as well. So the biopsy is taken in clinical theatre, popped into formalin fixative, and the histology request form is completed with clinical details ahead of sending over to the path lab with the sample. Now, depending on which trust you're in, that's either via porters or hospital transport systems. Obviously, some sites are out of the region and have additional logistical steps that can cause delay in the pathway. So potentially some kind of logistical mapping exercise might be useful in future to look at improving that. But the feedback from pathologists across the board at this stage is that there's need for improvement in the completeness of the request form with full clinical details to help direct histopathology colleagues a little bit better. Some sites are moving towards more electronic requesting, which will be a really positive step because that will help with the tracking of the samples and the cases across the pathway as well, but that's just not currently the picture across the region. So once the samples are in pathology then, the cases are then cross-referenced with clinical details provided. They're booked in for tracking purposes, and some sites also use a colour coding triage system to help with quick visualization really of whether the samples are urgent, non-urgent, if they're a specific sample type. So as we've gone, we've been able to share some of that good practice across the labs as well. Okay, so following the dissection and processing, the pathologist will interpret the H&E slide to confirm the diagnosis. They'll complete a pathology report, which is then usually uploaded to an online system. In this case, that is the telepath system. And clinicians can then gain access to that via ICE. The problem with that, which is also the case when any genomic test result is available as well, is that the clinical teams are not notified of the report's availability. So it requires somebody within the clinical team to log on every day to check if the results are available for each patient. Obviously, that's not an efficient use of anybody's time. And until there's a national solution which links together systems seamlessly, there is a need for a local solution to this problem because it's not just gynae, it's hampering all pathways, and I'll touch on this later on as well. So the endometrial pathway has more of a reflex flow to it. By comparison, ovarian cancers are discussed in the SMDT meeting following diagnosis to decide on any genomic testing required and the next steps for that patient. So taking the endometrial cancers then, MMR IHC testing is now reflexively requested by pathologists for Lynch syndrome. You'll probably all likely be aware that there's been a national programme running since 2021, I think, to support the implementation of the optimal Lynch testing pathways. And then ER and P53 testing is also reflexed at this point. So all tests are usually requested via an internal online lab system. There was one site that didn't have the IHC staining validated to be done in-house, so that had to be further outsourced to another pathology lab for the staining to be completed, ahead of being sent back to the originating trust for interpretation and reporting, clearly adding unnecessary time into the pathway. So that issue has now been resolved. That site's worked really hard to complete the validation for the IHC staining in-house, which is great. So the lighter blue boxes here just describe the steps taken depending on the MMR IHC results. Now this has been covered a lot in the last few years or so with the Lynch programme, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but essentially following the current guidance, the outcome of the IHC, the ER and the P53 result determines whether any further testing is required. And that could be by via MLH1 promoter hypermethylation testing or POLE testing. If no testing is required, then an addendum is added to the path report. If further testing is required, the admin team retrieve the block, pass that onto the lab for the preparation of samples or curls as per the SOP. And again, we found some variation across the patch here in that one site wasn't reflexively testing for POLE or MLH1 promoter hypermethylation in the gynae workstream, and instead we're waiting for that SMDT discussion to get the green light to go ahead for those tests, again adding time into the pathway. So we've worked with that trust now to ensure that reflexive testing is appropriately in place, and we've shared the POLE guidance with all MDTs again. So where are we? The samples are now packaged for delivery along with the genomic test request form and report, and posted via recorded delivery to the GLH. Again, a bit of variation across the patch. One site was sending their slides to the GLH via second class post rather than first class or recorded delivery. Again, just losing valuable time that we can gain back. So as we noticed any of these smaller variations during the pathway mapping stage of the work, we worked with trusts and supported them to make these smaller incremental improvements. So we've actually already been able to have a positive impact on turnaround times before we've even got to the auditing part of the pathways, which was a bigger chunk of the work, I suppose. Okay, so onto the results then, the bottom box. There are two ways for clinicians to access genomic test results. A, they are either sent via email from the GLH to the oncologist where that person is known, and B, the GLH send the results back to the histopathology lab that the test was requested from, who incorporate them into the path report and upload them again to ICE for the clinicians to log on to access. But where the oncologist isn't listed, the results would sit solely with pathology. So it's really, really good practice to incorporate and authorise those results within the pathology lab as soon as possible for clinical teams to be able to gain access to in case they are not emailed directly from the GLH, because I believe there are some inconsistencies. So I'll circle back to this later on when we discuss improvement potential. And then at this point, if Lynch syndrome is likely, this will be flagged at MDT, and the patient will be picked up by the local mainstreaming service within the trust. Prior to this year, a referral to clinical genetics would have been made, but a huge amount of training has gone into upskilling colleagues across the region to mainstream this service in-house. So a big thanks to our lead Lynch nurse, Mandy, for all her hard work on that. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the detail of the pathology maps and the processes for gynae. Okay. So as I mentioned in that flow diagram, testing for POLI is established based on the initial MMR-AHC, P53 and ER results. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this document. This is guidance that was published in April 22 by the British Association of Gynaecologists, really to provide a clear pathway flow to follow in cases where POLI testing should be required. All sites should now be following this model reflexively without needing to wait for MDT agreement, as I say. And further to this, there is actually more recent recommendations that have been published about the benefits of reflexively testing all endometrial cancer cases up front for POLI. This is not currently the case across Cheshire and Merseyside, and it will require an equitable standardised change for the region if we were to go down that route. And we'd obviously want to make sure that we weren't hampering other parts of the pathway and overwhelming other parts of the system. So any future changes to the pathway will be discussed as appropriate with stakeholders ahead of agreement and implementation, but just to make you aware. Okay, so the National Genomic Test Directory specifies which genomic tests are commissioned by the NHS in England, the technology by which they're available, and the patients who will be eligible to access the test. So this is just a snippet from the Cancer Test Directory for some of the gynae cancers, and I'll just pick out a few from there that are used. So BRCA and HRD testing can be requested depending on the initial pathology diagnosis and whether patients are eligible for first-line treatment. The initial test for Lynch syndrome, as I mentioned earlier, IHC testing, that's done locally at each path lab, but further testing for cases suggestive of Lynch for MLH1 promoter hypermethylation, that's sent to the Northwest GLH in Manchester. NTRK testing was reportedly more rarely requested, and that seemed to be in the palliative setting. And then the whole genome sequencing pilot for high-grade ovarian cancers is not actually currently utilised in our region. It is available, it's not currently utilised. I think there's no collection or logistical pathway set up currently, and actually it was reported that because other tests have so far been able to provide sufficient information to be able to manage treatment pathways for patients, there is seen to that whole genome sequencing has little additional benefit at this point in time. That may change in future, and it may change on a case-by-case basis, so we'll keep that one on our radar. And then I've already discussed POLI at the bottom. So these are just a few examples of the issues or the barriers that were reported across pathways and trusts. I've split them into audiences, so we've got pathology, clinical teams, and system-wide issues. Clearly, that's not an exhaustive list. Just picked out a few really for examples. So it was reported that molecular tests were often emailed to one individual person rather than a shared pathology email account. Obviously, that creates a single point of failure if that individual is on leave. So that's something for teams to be aware of to ensure that you know the process within your trust and you're requesting in the appropriate way. There were also some test requests that I think came through as emails to pathologies just requesting genomics on X, Y, or Z patients. So clearly there needs to be more specificity in those cases, perhaps through a degree of education on which tests should be done in which circumstances, or perhaps just standardising the request forms will be beneficial within trusts internally. So we'll take those discussions forward as we continue our evaluation phase of that project, this project. There's no clear, efficient pathway for the communication of results to oncologists. There are inconsistencies in how results are presented, whether that's at MDT or the results are chased when the patient is due in clinic. And we've talked through some of those issues earlier, but there is a national plan to improve IT interoperability around results. I imagine that's a fair few years off at the minute. So in the meantime, the Northwest GLH are trialling a portal through which tests can be requested, results can be accessed, and it also allows for easier tracking of cases through the whole pathway then as well. So we'll update as and when we can on those. We've already talked about the issue of one site having an embargo on first-class postage across the trust and second-class post being used. But as I say, that issue has now been resolved. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a need for improvement in the amount of clinical details provided to pathology. Again, this will form part of the discussions that are ongoing as part of the evaluation of this work. And then lastly, I mentioned that again, the molecular testing not happening reflexively where it was needed to, but hopefully those improvements have already been made. Okay, so onto the audit data then. In total, data was received relating to 473 samples across the 4 pathways in Cheshire and Merseyside. This data can actually only really be pulled manually through navigating several systems. So it was really, really time intensive for people to pull. But despite the major capacity issues that a lot of the labs were facing, we were actually able to get a full data set across the region. So we can now ensure that any benefits will be equitable. So a big, big thank you to everybody who was part of that data collection. So this is turnaround time data for cellular pathology on the left-hand side and genomic testing on the right. It's split by tumour group, basically to show the significant variation seen across Cheshire and Merseyside. I'm just sharing the regional data today rather than the trust-specific data that each lab have had sight of in their reporting. So the cellular pathology turnaround time then, that is the time from when samples arrived in the pathology lab to the time that the diagnostic report was completed. And you can see the distribution there on the left was similar across breast, colorectal and gynae, with the vast majority of samples having turnaround times of less than 20 days. The genomic testing turnaround time on the right is the time from the genomic test being requested to the time that the result was made available to the clinical teams. And again, you can see the wide distribution on the chart there on the right, with gynae having the widest distribution. Gynae genomic pathway turnaround times ranged from 7 to 333 days. I assume some weren't uploaded into the system, with 50% of cases taking between 25 to 40 days. Again, clear room for improvement across the board. So this chart shows the time taken from the date that the genomic test results were received by the path lab to when they were integrated into the path report, ultimately to be made available to the clinical teams to access via ICE. And we've already talked about how the results are distributed from the GLH, the issues that clinicians can face in accessing those, as well as the potential future solutions with the GLH portal as well, and plans for interoperability improvement. So I'm not going to cover that again, but these are just a couple of the examples of what we've compared, but there was lots of these bubble charts that we picked out comparing points across the pathway, and they are included in the evaluations to trusts. So onto the evaluations then. I've produced lab-specific evaluation reports for each of our 6 pathology labs across Cheshire and Merseyside. And those reports contain tumour group process maps, the regional audit data, and then each lab-specific audit data, as well as recommendations for pathway improvement. And similarly, as to before, I've split those into pathology, clinical and system-wide improvements, some of which you can see on the right-hand side there. So as I say, each pathology lab has received these, and I will share the slides for info, but just to discuss a couple of examples really. For pathology improvements, potentially reporting neoplastic cell content as standard for all samples during the diagnostic workup would help speed up the pathway later on when the genomic testing is required. And then regionally, again, considering implementing POLE testing up front in the pathway for all endometrial cancers would be a potential to improve the pathway. But the feasibility of that would, of course, have to be discussed and agreed by all stakeholders to ensure parts of the system aren't overwhelmed, for example, the GLH. Clinical improvements then, improving the way that information is captured during each MDT, standardising genomic test requests and ensuring that the oncologist is listed are a few of the examples listed there. And then system-wide improvements. So among other things, we know that the need for genomic education across the board is evident. The Northwest GMSA completed a project last year called the Training Needs Analysis Project, TNA, which through questionnaire and interview collated from colleagues across the Northwest, worked to identify gaps in education and training for all workforce groups concerning genomics and the application of genomic testing within cancer pathways. So this is the second genomics education webinar that we've pulled together, which we hope will provide really useful information to you. Obviously, we're keen to hear feedback from you all following the webinar, so we can make sure these are as valuable and beneficial to you all. Next steps then. So I've collated these reports now. They were each report was about 50 pages for each lab, and so it was too much really to take forward. So I've collated the evaluation reports into one regional higher level document with all the higher level recommendations. And we intend to take that forward across Cheshire and Merseyside to implement action. I don't want these to sit stagnant. We want to really build on the momentum that we've gained. So a pathology genomics lead for Cheshire and Merseyside will be appointed very soon, hopefully, to be able to help and support with the embedding of these recommendations to help optimise pathway services, ensure equity of access to genomic testing as well across the pathology network. And then, as I mentioned, this is our second genomics educational webinar, and we'll continue to work through the remainder of the tumour groups that IMPACTT is focused on across the Northwest. These will be made available on the Northwest GMSA website, as well as our Cancer Academy locally, and they'll be in bite-sized chunks, so hopefully they'll be easily digestible in a time-friendly way as well. Cheshire and Merseyside Cancer Alliance have developed a genomic strategy for the next few years to help focus and align our workflows with the Northwest GMSA, Clatterbridge Cancer Centre Genomics Steering Group, the GLH and Cheshire and Merseyside Pathology Network as well, so that we're all working towards the common goals and working together. And we're going to continue to monitor and measure improvements, with potentially extending IMPACTT into other tumour groups as well, if resource allows. So that's all from me today. I'll leave you with the contact details of my programme manager for anybody to get in touch if they have any queries.